Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program. On today's show, how could be explained the increase of hate crimes, racism, and white supremacists in the U.S. that are victims our Latin American communities? Our guest, Sindy Benavides, Chief Executive Officer of LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, the largest and older national Latino civil rights organization in the country. Sindy Benavides, a warm welcome to the program.
Thank you, Jorge, for having me.
Sindy, an article of the television network France 24 was talking about the phenomenon, the factor of Trump in the increase of hate crimes. Is he a factor?
Absolutely. What we see in America is a president that uses his power to really dispute hate and words that incite action. The fact that he said invasion hundreds of times and kicked off his campaign with calling Mexicans all kinds of words are just completely ineffectual.
Yeah, and saying rapists, but they are rapists, bring the crime, bring drugs, and maybe some of them could be good people.
And you know that when you make generalizations like that, that's important that we note, because those type of generalizations create actions and impact people. What we saw in El Paso, where we had the gentleman who killed over 20 people and injured dozens of others, was that in his memo he cited Hispanics as being invaders, or as invading America. And we know that there's a direct link with what President Trump has said when we talk about our community.
Precisely. After he's been arrested, the author of the massacre in El Paso, he said, I was trying to kill as many Mexicans as I could, and as you said, and I wanted to stop the Hispanic invasion. So clearly a hate crime. And the FBI says that hate crime has increased about 17% in 2017 and 25% among Hispanics. Very, very worrisome figures.
Very worrisome, Jorge, but we think it's actually a lot higher because hate crimes are oftentimes underreported, and it's also voluntary for the departments to report it to the FBI. So we actually think that the numbers could be as much as 3 to 4 times higher than what's actually reported.
Is Trump a racist?
We think he is. You know, when he calls our Mexican children invaders, when he calls people who have been here for generations invaders, when he supports the ideology of birthright citizenship, which comes from white supremacy ideology and a hierarchy where whites are the dominant race, it's a problem, and we think there's a direct link.
Is this a new phenomenon, or is simply that is being increased by that sort of rhetoric of President Trump?
You know, white supremacy is not a new phenomenon. It has existed in the U.S. for decades, if not more than hundreds of years. We saw it with our Native American community. We saw it when our African community was enslaved. We saw it in the early 20th century. We see it today. And what we see is that Trump is playing to a radical white supremacist base to increase his political points as he gears up for November 3rd of next year, his re-election.
What is the role that you believe that is playing in all that, the mass media? We're talking about the common networks that we're watching every night, but also the social media. And for example, you have the case of Breitbart, a website that at a moment has been also linked was Stephen Bannon, an extreme right activist, supremacist if you want, and he was the chief strategic advisor of President Trump at the White House. What all that is saying?
You know, media plays such an important role, Jorge. We've seen this when we saw Europe happen during World War II. We see it today, and what we're seeing is that there are channels that specifically have an audience that's either to the left or to the right. What folks have to understand is that oftentimes what folks are doing, they're commentating, they're commentators. They're giving their opinions that are not based on numbers and they're not based on facts. And particularly as a millennial, someone who reads her information online, who often looks at social media, we have to be very careful of how we take the information that we consume and that we do our own research, that it is actually based on facts and not on someone's opinion.
In the case of Hispanics, we are talking that they are target, as you were mentioning in the case of the murder in El Paso, because they are Mexicans or they are Hispanics. In this case, the problem is the color of the skin that could be darker. The ethnic origin. To be Hispanic in the US is an ethnic origin, like to be European, is not a race. Or the simple fact that they are immigrants, and in this case, mostly poor immigrants. The discrimination is because of what? Of the three elements.
You know, we think it could be a combination of all three. We've certainly seen the rhetoric increase around immigrants, and there is a link of immigrants to Mexicans that this president has made. And so when we look at the increase of hate crimes against a nationality, what we're seeing is that this could be linked to several factors. You know, whether it's the way that you may be perceived to look. In America, the fact that we're a nation of immigrants, there's no particular look. I think this is more an ideology of white supremacy.
We're talking about El Paso, a border city. The other side of the border, just few miles away, is Ciudad Juárez, a Mexican city. 80% of the population of El Paso are from Mexican origin, and mostly what we could see is that for the first time after that massacre, some of the neighbors, the natives, are saying, for the first time ever, I feel scared to speak Spanish in public. Your organization was there.
We were there on the ground. We have members who live, who work in El Paso. Our second headquarters is based in El Paso, Texas. And, you know, interestingly enough, El Paso has always been one of the safest cities in America, with the migration daily of Mexicanos and of Americans to Mexico. And so really interestingly enough, when we talked to our community on the ground, there was a level of fear that they had not experienced before, because this direct assault was on them for who they were, in terms of their race, in terms of the language that they speak. And I think this fear is not only in El Paso, Jorge. I think this is all across America, where we have to watch our back for being who we are under this administration.
In the case of the immigration, the issue, for example, has to do a lot with the US foreign policy and trade practices. For example, in the first 10 years of the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, the US was giving $55 billion of subsidies to the agriculturist companies in the US to be able to export with prices completely dumped to Mexico. They left 2.3 million agricultural workers from Mexico with no job, jobless. Many of them, they were forced to come here. And therefore, they crossed the border and they demonize them. They use it as many things that are the modern slavery. And on top of that, they blame them, as Donald Trump does, like they bring the crime, the rapists, they bring the drugs. Is that perverse?
You know, it's an interesting history that we have, Jorge, when it comes to our foreign policy. And it reminds me of the book In Our Own Backyard by Legrand, where it really talks about the decades of involvement of the U.S. in Central America and Latin America, and the cause and effect that it's had in terms of what we're seeing today. Immigration didn't happen overnight. This has been happening for decades. And we have to, as Americans, take a step back and really understand the role that our foreign policy has played and what we're seeing today. What we're seeing today is not the root causes, it's the symptoms, what we're seeing at the border. The root causes truly are in the Central American countries where we have been involved for decades.
And in many cases, as an article in the New York Times is mentioning, they said those immigrants are here, they say the article, because the West went there first and they robbed them the future. They say they are here because we were there. So there is a responsibility of the Western world to put the other countries that are quote unquote underdeveloped in the situation that they are, and therefore forcing people to migrate. We're talking about 250 million people in the world being forced to migrate.
You know, what we don't often talk about, Jorge, is also the role that climate change plays in terms of what we're seeing not only in Latin America, but across the globe. What LULAC advocates for is a Marshall Plan that invests over $50 billion in Central America, Nicaragua, and Venezuela to stabilize the region, to make sure that the infrastructure is being built so that people could feel feel safe to be at home, feel that they don't have to leave their country, the language, their families, to come to another country to try to support them and to try to live, because of the high crime rates that exist in those countries and the lack of opportunities.
In the case of Donald Trump, going back to his rhetoric, that clearly was indicating many, many symptoms. Suddenly, because there are 4 women, Congresswomen from the Democratic Party, that they have no mercy to criticize his policies, they came out and he was singled them out and disqualifying them, saying that if they don't like the country, they should go back to the countries of origin. One of them has to do with Palestinian origin, other one with Muslim origin, another one with Somalian origin and also Muslim, and the 4th one is from Puerto Rican origin, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But given the fact that, for example, that Ilham Omar is from Somalia, he has said before in his rhetoric that the countries from Africa and Haiti are shithole countries. So therefore he was saying indirectly, you're coming from a shithole country, go back there, because you, what? He's saying you don't belong to here? Is that what he's saying?
He is, well, first of all, he is attacking our democracy. When you attack members of Congress who are speaking out against things that you're saying because they're not factual, you're attacking the very core of our democracy that allows us to have this back and forth, this checks and balances system. The fact is that President Trump directly stated that they were less American or they were not American enough. And that is a dangerous precedent when you have individuals from all backgrounds in this country that are part of our democracy, who are in positions of power, because he is undermining their words. He's undermining who they are. He's undermining the fact that they represent states and that they represent districts here in America.
And the 4 of them are Americans.
And the 4 of them are Americans or naturalized citizens. You know, the fact that you're attacking Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is of Puerto Rican descent, by the way, a territory that is of the U.S., Puerto Ricans who are U.S.-born citizens, it's a problem because you are, in a way, indirectly upholding the ideology of white supremacy.
Precisely. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has visited what he here in this country are calling detention centers in the border with Mexico. She described them as concentration camps. We're talking about the policy of zero tolerance of Trump in terms of immigrants and separation of families. Your thoughts?
You know, when you have children behind cages, when you have parents that are being separated from children, it cannot but remind you of what we did to our Japanese community. It cannot but remind you during World War II. It cannot but remind you of what happened in Europe to our Jewish community. Is it the same? It's not the same, but there are similarities. And the fact that in America in 2019, you have children, you have babies in cages, you have parents who are not able to feed their children, you have malnourished children, you have women who are not able to access the basic sanitary things that they need monthly. It's a problem. And I think this will be, Jorge, the darkest period in our history books that America will remember.
Is he doing it, is he, meaning his government, do it that on purpose precisely because he has clearly identified a target, a political target, as you said, in order to be re-elected in 2020 with Hispanics, with Latin Americans?
You know, Jorge, the fact that he had Stephen Bannon as one of his top advisors, the fact that he surrounds himself with individuals who support FAIR, the fact that he believes that
FAIR is an organization that are against immigration of foreigners, regardless from which parts of the world.
Correct. And the fact that he supports birthright citizenship, which is an ideology that white supremacists believe in, the fact that he calls Mexicans rapists, that so many other things, the fact that he has called Hispanics invaders, there's a direct link. And we do believe as a civil rights organization that he is on the wrong side of history and that the years will tell.
What your organization is doing facing all that situation?
You know, Jorge, we're doing a lot of different things. First and foremost, we're not being silent. Our job is to speak out against any civil rights violations against our community. And most importantly, as we head into 2020, as a Latino civil rights organization, we will be registering every eligible voter that we can register in the United States. Every 30 seconds in the U.S., a Latino turns 18. That's almost 1 million additional eligible voters. And our hope is that the Latino community will turn out in massive numbers, that they will remember the power that they have, and that they will show up November 3rd in numbers unheard of. And that in itself will create fear in President Trump that he will lose this election.
Because most definitely it seems that there's still a way to go in terms of Hispanics not having very clear the power of going to the polls and vote.
And we're beginning to develop that, right? Like, I think many in our community don't understand and are disillusioned by the government process. What they see on TV is very divisive. And that's where we step in and say, you have a role to play. Every single one of us has a role to play in this country. And that this is our country, this is the America that is a nation of immigrants, and that as Latinos, we are the future.
And your organization is all over the 50 states.
We are in more than 37 states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico.
And for you, what do you think that is going to be the trend from here to November 2020? Because the issue of hate crimes, of the issue of divisiveness, the issue of racism and white supremacy is growing presence, and you see among, for example, the Democrat pre-presidential candidates. So there is something going on that this issue is much more commented than 2 years ago.
And I will say, Jorge, that white supremacy is not only a U.S.-based thought. I would say white supremacy is a global network of people who are being radicalized to think that for being white, you are above others. That, you know, what we're seeing in terms of hate crimes is not only in the U.S., we saw it in New Zealand, we saw it in Australia, we've seen hate crimes against the Jewish community across the entire globe. This is not only domestic, though there has been increase for sure domestically of what is happening when it comes to the white supremacy.
And in the case of Charlottesville, Virginia, not that far from here from Washington, I will say like a couple of hours driving, there is this gathering of neo-Nazis, and they just face anti-fascist groups. And after that incident, that is one person killed because of the neo-Nazis killing that person in a car incident, Donald Trump say there were nice people on both sides, nice people from both sides. Your reaction?
You know, in July of this year, Jorge, the head of the FBI, Mr. Wray, testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee. And what he said is that there were more than 100 incidents of domestic terrorism, and that the majority of them were linked to white supremacy. When you have a president who does not directly tear down or say, this is not right, you know, we should not support this ideology, it's a problem because you're indirectly supporting them.
Sindy Benavides, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Jorge.